International Center for extending their kind invitation to me to make a presentation to you. I was given this topic more or less, so this is one of those dry subjects in economics. And here we have a wider field beyond economists. We have sociologists and anthropologists and management experts and accountants and lawyers. So I will try to be not too technical about my presentations. In recent economic history in India, we have been a little bit on a roller coaster in terms of our taxation experience. We started off, if you really look at our tax to GDP ratios over recent years from the 1990s. Remember, in the beginning of the 1990s, we had an economic crisis, and we had only 3 weeks of imports in foreign exchange, and liberalization was started, and taxation and reform of taxation was one of the major ingredients. And you can see that in the 1991 economic program, there was an attempt to increase our tax to GDP ratio. What I have plotted there is not the tax to GDP ratio, but the rate of growth of the tax to GDP ratio. So the rate of growth of tax to GDP ratio between 1990-91 and 1992-93 was about 2.5%. The plot is between 0 and 5. So that way you can see how much our tax to GDP ratio was growing or decreasing each year. So from the previous year, we increased our tax to GDP ratio by almost 25% in real terms, because this is tax to GDP. So therefore, it's an inflation and inflation both in numerator and denominator, it cancels out. So in real terms, we achieved the highest tax to GDP ratio growth. And that is that period that I call the golden era of tax revenue to GDP growth in our country. This is our, and today we are still continuing. We have, from a low trough, we have increased our tax to GDP ratio increases quite a bit, but it is still a fledgling area, and every year we are having tax to GDP growth. But why I'm saying that this is not, because you have to do it in the right way. The quality of increase in the tax to GDP ratio has to be high. And my view, which I'll tell you later, is that that quality is not yet good. We have to have the right manner in which we increase our tax to GDP ratio. Now I can do the next. Just to illustrate a little bit, at that time, you see that in the 2007-8 period, when the golden era started, for the first time, the income tax, or what I call the direct tax, it includes corporate income tax, personal income tax, capital gains tax, and so on. That increase in terms of GDP crossed like a scissors over indirect tax. And indirect tax is a dotted line. In other words, the corporates were paying a lot of income tax during that period, and so it crossed for the first time, and that was an indication that we took, because in most developed countries, the direct taxes in terms of GDP are much higher than the indirect taxes. So historically, having crossed it, we felt that we have crossed a hallmark in our taxation history, a hallmark of kind of development, you might say. But then we have again come closer and closer, and the income tax department probably hopes that we will cross it again, and they will, from an administrative point of view, they can reclaim their position. But this is just an offshoot of what happened. The next. In the next one, and probably this is one of the very last ones that I'll use in terms of graphs, is to show what I was telling you. This is simply not the rate of growth of tax GDP ratio, but the tax to GDP. What is the tax to GDP doing in terms of different taxes. You can see during the 2007-8 period onwards how the corporate tax to GDP has increased in, I've just fitted a polynomial instead of actual lines in order to give you a smooth look. And you see how it has increased, that the kind of big lines, the convex curve. And then you have the next solid line, which is sort of like a whale in an ocean, the part of a whale that you can see in an ocean, and that decreased. So the excise taxes, we used to collect a lot of it, but that decreased over time, and the corporate income tax increased over time. So the nature of our tax collection, the nature of corporate contribution changed a lot, and therefore we experienced during that time a kind of modernization in our experience in taxation. And we entered a period, unfortunately it was ephemeral, but we entered a period of very good experience as though we were catching up with the rest of the world, which we were certainly doing. So what happened once the crash came and economic recovery was slow to come? Here the story changes. Now we are in chapter 2, so to speak, of what I'm saying. Tax in general has to be considered in about 4 parts. One is tax policy, how you design tax policy. Second, how do you write the tax law? Third, how do you administer that written tax law? And fourth, what are the outcomes that you experience? In order to probably get the revenue, or whatever the motivation of lost revenue, we made, I think, a few errors in the formulation of tax policy. The first major error, I feel, was to pass several laws retrospectively, which is very rare in the world. And second, we made our tax rules very complex. So both the law and the administrative rules became extremely complex. We also introduced very strong rules such as the general anti-avoidance rules, which presumes that a company, in particular when it has dealings abroad, indulges in anti-avoidance or indulges in avoidance, and therefore the government needs to put anti-avoidance rules, and in general it defines what it will be. Of course that can happen. So how you design what is called GAR, General Anti-Avoidance Rules, is very, very important, because you don't want to kill the golden goose. You want the company to function, but be careful and not avoid. But you can't create an impossibility of performance. Therefore, one of the great difficulties was short-term policy making that had long-term economic impact. And you cannot blame administrators alone, because administrators administer the law. I mean, they may have been a part of making the change, but these fundamental changes, finally, of course, the accountability has to be on the policymakers. At the same time, for some time, 2 policy areas for structural change were going on. One was the GST, the other was the DTC. GST, Goods and Services Tax, and DTC, the direct tax code or the income tax code. Just for a minute, let me dwell on this. The GST is ideally a complete reform of indirect taxes. One chain would be covering all the center and cover all our value-added taxes on goods and services for the center, and another chain would cover all goods goods and services for the states. And ideally, if one agrees with the structure, it is a very simple structure, and all kinds of input tax credit would be given again from one good to the service and service to goods and so on and so forth. And there would be no mix-up between the center and the states. There would be two parallel chains. And ideally, you could even have a single tax return for the taxpayer, submitting one to the center and one to the state. Or submitting it to the state and the state gives one copy to the center, or to the center gives it to the respective state. So it's just ideally very, very simple, and many countries have in fact, or a few countries have achieved it only at the central level. But our government is a federal government that comprises both the center and the states. Therefore, we must have a complex system which covers both center and states. Unless we have the right structure under the GST and introduce it, we can call it a GST, but it won't be one. And the whole world would recognize it as a GST. So I have always advised to industry, that industry keeps on saying, well, if you have a GST, our GDP will grow by 1.5% and let's have it. So everyone is presuming that it will be a great benefit. But I tell them I haven't done the analysis. And I think there's a great deal of possibility for research organizations and institutions like this very prestigious institution also to take up some independently some research on this matter. The other one is the direct tax code. Our income tax, if you see over the years, has become thicker and thicker and thicker. So two major structural tax reform, policy reform that have to be taken up in the right way and a finality reached are GST and TDC. Now, the other thing I feel we need to do is to professionalize the writing of tax law. In most countries, tax law is actually written by a tax law department of the tax administration. In India, we have to move in that direction because the way it is written, the various interpretations of the tax law leads to a lot of disputes. Another area in tax administration, its modernization, is can the tax administration reorient itself towards treating the taxpayer as a customer. In many tax administrations today, the word taxpayer doesn't exist anymore. The word used is customer or stakeholder. Usually customer is an individual and stakeholder is a corporate or firm. So customer focus together with everything else has many, many particular characteristics. And the tax administration currently is challenged with that. And they are considering it, but they have to modernize briskly in order to move away from the paradigm that a tax payer is fundamentally prone to tax evasion. So the issue is, you can think of it as a phrase, respect all, suspect all. But I think you cut up the second part and say respect all and find out if there's an issue. Don't suspect all. How is that tax administration structured? Are we similar to other tax administrations, or are we too different? The answer is we are too different. First and foremost, in most tax administrations, the administrations are divided by function and sector, whereas we are divided by geography. Whereas we have divided ourselves historically into two departments. One is for excise, customs and service tax, one is for income tax. So that advantage for reducing evasion is not reaped. So both what goes in favor of the customer and what goes in disfavor of the evader are not in control of the administration today. And we have to look at using information technology. For example, I wonder how many people here who are filing taxes are doing so electronically, or your accountants are doing so electronically. The vast majority. So you can imagine the amount of data that are being generated. So how do we use this data? How do we analyze this data about the nature of our taxpayers? In many tax administrations today, those data are used to segment taxpayers. So internal use of ICT, information and communication technology, is something that we must gather because we are getting all kinds of data and we have developed tremendous skills. So one area where the tax departments have moved forward is the ICT. And there we have had many very successful PPP experiences with TCS, with Pro, and all of this are done through government contract and so on and so forth. Thus, you can see that tax policy and administration in India over the last 22 years, I would say, have gone through a kind of cyclical experience. We have experienced a period of tremendous advancements, then we have had a collapse, now we are trying to regain. But the major challenge today, I feel, the central challenge is how do we modernize tax administration? How do we move the philosophy from every tax-paying individual or company as possibly a tax evader, so let's just ring-fence them, to no, they will voluntarily comply, they need our help, and those that we find to be evaders to take strong action. So with that in mind, today I encourage you to take a positive look at the tax administration as citizens, and together, I believe, in 5 years, we should try to achieve an openness from tax administration, and so that we can convert them into looking at us as voluntarily complying with tax, so that they can then identify the real tax evaders and proceed with that for a minority of taxpayers, rather than a general attitude that respect all, suspect all. Thank you very much.